So we're doing lesson number 11 in the quarterly Jeremiah, and the title this week is The Covenant. And the memory text is a very famous memory text, Jeremiah 31:31, and it says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah." When you hear the word covenant, what comes to mind? What does it mean?
Promise or agreement between people.
Promise or agreement between people.
Mutual promise.
Mutual promise. Other thoughts? So the famous covenant that gets talked about very, very frequently is the covenant made with Abraham. And a few months ago, I was in California doing a TV interview with Mike Tucker at the Lifestyle Magazine TV show. And one of our online class members and friend, Luann Seraphine, was there. And we were talking at lunch about covenants. And Mike told us that the covenant made with Abraham was called a suzerain covenant, which I had not really ever heard about before. And Luann went home and sent me her notes on this. And I put those in our notes, so if you'd like to look at those. But the suzerain covenant is a covenant between a person who is a superior or in power with someone who's an inferior. The person in power is called the suzerain, and the inferior person is called the vassal. There really isn't anything in modern culture similar to these types of covenants. The closest they say is the marriage covenant relationship, where there's a public ceremony and a commitment to two people to be in a contract, if you will, a marriage contract, a marriage relationship agreement. That's the closest in our culture of a cultural covenant that was similar to the suzerain covenant of Abraham's time. And when they would join themselves, there were several aspects to this. They would have a sacrifice and a meal together during the covenant. The Lord promised to provide Abraham with a large family and a homeland, and Abraham's promise was to trust the Lord. That's what Abraham had to promise. Now, the two big differences between the covenants that were carried out between human beings and the one that God and Abraham did is that typically in a suzerain covenant, the vassal, the one in the inferior position, had a whole bunch of responsibilities imposed upon him or her by the one in charge, the suzerain. In Genesis 15, however, really nothing is stated about Abraham's responsibilities. It's focused on what the Lord will do, and Abraham was simply to cherish all these things in his heart. He didn't have actually a lot of behavioral responsibilities. The second difference is the subordinate, the vassal, was to take the animal and sacrifice it in two and walk down between the two halves of the animal, symbolically saying, if I break this covenant with you, the person in power, this is what is going to happen to me. And you know, in Abraham's covenant, it was the animals that the burning fire walked down between the animals, which was basically God putting himself in that position, saying, I would rather die than break my promises with you. So covenant, agreement. First two paragraphs in Sabbath lesson says the following. It says, although the Bible speaks of covenants in the plural, there is only one basic covenant, the covenant of grace, which God bestows, in which God bestows salvation upon fallen beings who claim it by faith. The idea of plural covenants arises from the various ways God has restated the essential covenant promise in order to meet the needs of his people in different times and settings. But whether it's the Adamic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the Sinaitic covenant, the Davidic covenant, or the new covenant, the idea is the same. The salvation God provides is a gift, unmerited and undeserved, and the human response to that gift, in a sense, humanity's holding upon its side of the deal, is faithfulness and obedience. Thoughts about that? Questions?
That's not the language you use with your children.
What language do you use with children?
Well,
We have a covenant.
unmerited, undeserved attention is not really part of that equation.
Yeah. So where do you think this, I like where you're going with this. Where do you think this idea that grace is unmerited, undeserved? So if your child is 3 and, has a temper tantrum, doesn't want their broccoli, throws it on the floor. Any parent ever faced a situation like this? My mother faced it constantly. And Do you say, you don't deserve this, but? What does the child deserve at that point?
Correction.
Could you argue that the child actually deserves a parent that loves them and will treat them with grace? Especially if the child was brought into the world by that parent. Could you make that argument? It's not the argument that's typically given theologically, and so keep that idea in mind. This idea of grace is often argued as unmerited favor, that we don't deserve it, but God gives it, because where do they focus the attention? Where does that argument arise? The focus is where?
On us.
On us. But if you switch the focus to the character of God, then what do you come up with?
He couldn't do anything but
He couldn't do anything but that. That's his nature. That's his character. In fact, he would rather die than not intervene. Think about a parent who would rather die than harm their child. Isn't that how it works?
Yeah.
So I think the focus is, again, very self-centered, egocentric. And much of Christianity is egocentric, self-centered. How can I be saved? How can I get my sins paid for? How can I get my sins erased? When I get to heaven, no one will know the deeds that I've done because they've gone into judgment beforehand and be erased out of the books. And on we go. So all covenants are an expression of the covenant of grace. I would agree with that, which is, stated succinctly, the covenant of grace is, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That is the covenant of grace. God loved us too much to let us go. That's what it was. So God committed himself to reverse what Adam did to the species human and to restore this creation back to its original design. That's what God committed himself to do. What do you think is conveyed in the idea from the lesson of faithfulness and obedience? Faithfulness and obedience. That our response is faithfulness and obedience. What's conveyed in this idea?
Behavior.
Behavior.
Wants.
Pardon?
Behavior is what God wants. That's what that's implying.
And that implies a condition as well.
What condition?
Obedience.
Oh, you mean a condition upon the grace is conditional, is what you're saying. It's like conditional love now. Many of my patients really have struggled with their sense of well-being because they were raised in homes where they experienced that the love was conditional. If I didn't do then I wasn't loved. I was only loved for how well I performed. And they have a lot of what we would call perfectionistic tendencies. Yes?
Yeah, it sort of puts us in the position of a criminal defendant who's asking the judge to give them a break they don't deserve, and then they're placed on probation. But if they mess up, they're going to get violated on probation and locked up.
Right. Right. And then, go ahead, Russell.
My thought when we were first reading this covenant is my mind automatically went to a legal mindset.
Yeah.
You know, we have contracts, legal contracts, legal covenants. Even the marriage contract today is it's a state mandated legal contract with certain penalties for breaking the contract and rewards for staying in the contract. Might God have been trying to take Abraham a step toward a natural law understanding because he's reversed the roles. God, the fire went through the split animal instead of Abraham.
I like it. So this idea of obedience then, let's think about it. Instead of this behavior, let's look at somebody who is in the line, the progenitor of Christ, Rahab. Rahab is in the hall of faith in Hebrews, which makes her faithful. But what did she do? She lied.
But she helped the spies.
Had sex for money.
God looks at the intention, and I think the faith is a gift of the Holy Spirit.
So this is my point. By putting Rahab in this context, it really kind of blows apart this idea that faithfulness is on how well you perform. Faithfulness is the motive of the heart. So if you had a 3-year-old and you were out weeding in your garden, and you're pulling weeds around your tomato plants, and your 3-year-old comes up behind you, sees what you're doing, pulls up a tomato plant, and with a big smile goes, "Help, Mommy?" Do you spank them for their wickedness? They didn't pull a weed, they pulled a tomato plant. Their performance is not very good. Bad performance. Or do you recognize the faithfulness, the good-heartedness here? You're looking at the heart, not the performance. What happens if you have a teenager you send out to weed, and they only pull weeds, don't damage the tomato plant, but they curse you the entire time because they can't be on their Game Boy? You see, this is the prodigal and the older brother. This is Christianity by and large. The people sitting on the pews who never have made a public mistake. Okay, they've not been vetted by the media. They have no public incriminations for the church. They sit there with their nose in the air like the older brother, critical of the Rahabs and those who have stumbled and fallen. But those who have, like Rahab or the child who pulls up the tomato plant, they're the ones with the tender hearts, but they get beaten down oftentimes by the critics. So this idea of obedience in the New Testament, the Greek word for obedience in the New Testament is hupokeo. And it has two halves. The first half, hupo, we get the word hypo, like hypoglycemic, hypotension, hypodermic. It means under or low. And the last half is where we get the word acoustics or acoustical. And it means to hear or to listen. And so the Greek word obedience, actually in the New Testament, it is translated obedience, to obey or obey. And what it means is a humble willingness to listen. That's what it means. A low, humble listening. So, not how well you perform. We see this even today. This is why Jesus in the scripture was always saying things like, hearing, though they do not hear. Let him who has ears hear. Okay? This was what obedience is. They're disobedient because they're stiff-necked and hard-hearted and they don't listen. The obedient, they have ears that hear. And so we even say today things like this. Do you hear me? Are you listening? Okay? And we're not talking about are the sound waves hitting their tympanic membranes and stimulating their acoustic neurons. We're talking about are they comprehending? Are they actually understanding what you're saying? Are they, I hear you. Talk to the hand. I hear you. You know, they're not listening even though they're listening. This is the big it's about the heart attitude. So humble willingness to listen, example, the classic example in the ancient times, the master actually had a person who sat at the gate of his estate, and the job title for this person was the hupaokue. That was his job title, the same word as we get obedience from. And when the landowner or the master would approach, he would shout out that he's coming, and it was the job of that person to get up and open the gate. That was his job, to humbly listen, humbly wait and listen. And then when he listened, but what happens if he gets up and he goes to open the gate, but the gate has been rusted shut, or there's a wooden gate, it's got humidity or rain and it's swollen, and with all of his weight, with all of his might, he can't get the gate open. And so the master has to actually get off his horse and lean into it with him, and together they open the gate. Is he a disobedient servant? Because he couldn't do it. No, it's not about performance. We make it always about performance. It's about a humble willingness to listen and then follow the prescription. It's about the motivation of the heart. So why is this, think about it, why is this type of obedience, the humble willingness to listen, to understand, to hear, our responsibility in the covenant of grace? This is our responsibility in the covenant. Why? Well, what's the war between God and Satan over? God's character and trustworthiness, right? Which means, can I trust him or not? That's the big question. And where is the battlefield? In our minds. 2 Corinthians 10:3-5. What are the weapons of Satan?
Lies.
Lies are primary, deception primary, and then coercion, coercive pressure, and selfishness in the heart. Okay, what are the weapons of God? Truth, love, freedom. There you go, big ones. So what is it that determines righteousness? Righteousness, behavior or heart?
Heart.
Heart. Clearly it's heart. So as the heart is healed, it is true that the behaviors begin to change. But what is the key to changing the heart? It's trust in God, isn't it? And what is the key to trusting God?
Knowing him.
The truth about who he is, or knowing him. And what is the key to understanding or assimilating truth? A heart that humbly willing to listen and follow the truth. That's why the biblical, or our response in the covenant, is a mind that loves truth, a heart that loves truth, humbly willing to be corrected, to be re-instructed and directed based on the evidence of truth. And I would again put forth the integrative approach that you don't believe just powerful speakers or proclamations or declarations or even quotations from Scripture. The devil quoted Scripture. But you integrate that into an understanding of how God's design laws work in reality and your own life experiences. They all have to harmonize. This is our experience. If we really hear God, we are one to trust. Open the heart, the Spirit comes in and takes all that Christ achieves, reproduces it in us, so it's no longer I that live, but Christ lives in me.